Hello, my name is Jean-Jacques. In this video I will talk about the geopolitics of sub-Saharan Africa. It will be the 7th video of the series titled Geography and Power, in which I describe the strength and the weaknesses of the different world civilizations. For Western Europe, Africa has always been the closest continent on the planet, and yet it was the last one to be colonized by Europeans. For Europeans navigators, Africa was an obstacle on the way to Asia. That anomaly can easily be explained. Let's start by saying that when we talk about Africa, we must always remember that it is much larger than what people believe, since any territory close to the equator, like Africa, appears smaller than it really is on a world map. If it is like that, it's because it's impossible to draw the map of a three-dimensional sphere on a two-dimensional map without creating a distortion. In fact, that distortion is so important that the aerial distance between the city of Conakry in Guinea and the island of Socotra in the Indian Ocean is 7,365 kilometers, while the distance between Oslo and the city of Magadan on the Pacific Ocean is only 6,236 kilometers. In reality, Africa is 3 times larger than Europe. Of course, when we talk about sub-Saharan Africa, we must exclude the Sahara Desert, which is really a part of North Africa, which means that the sub-Saharan Africa is actually twice as large as Europe. Unlike Europe, which has a complicated coastline with many bays, peninsulas, coastal islands and archipelagos, Africa has a very short and linear coastline with very few bays and coastal islands. On top of that, Black Africa is surrounded by uninhabited regions. First, there is the Sahara Desert, which is the largest desert on the planet, and second, there are the Indian and the Atlantic Ocean, which are almost empty in the southern hemisphere. Worse, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, there is Amazonia, which has always been sparsely populated. The natural isolation of Black Africa is increased by the fact that there are many plateaus in the center of the continent. As a result, most of the largest African rivers are interrupted by cataracts and rapids that make them non-navigable all the way to the oceans. For example, the Nile River, whose sources are in sub-Saharan Africa, is interrupted by cataracts situated south of the city of Aswan in Upper Egypt. The Congo River, which is navigable for nearly 2,500 kilometers upstream of Kinshasa in Congo, is also interrupted by a series of falls and rapids for 350 kilometers just before reaching the Atlantic Ocean. As a result, the population living near the Congo River never had an easy access to the rest of the civilized world. The Limpopo and Zambezi rivers are also interrupted by rapids and falls, including the famous Victoria Falls. In northwestern Africa, the Niger River, whose sources are only 240 kilometers east of the Atlantic Ocean, does not flow towards that ocean, but towards the center of the continent, for finally reaching the Atlantic Ocean in the very isolated Gulf of Guinea. The Okavango River, whose sources are in Angola, is even more isolated since it never reaches the Atlantic Ocean and simply dies into a vast Botswana marsh where its waters evaporate. The natural isolation of Africa explains why most African kingdoms of the past didn't have seafaring fleets like Egypt or ancient Greece. It was the case with the empires built in the early 19th century by the Fulani Usman Dan Fodio in the Sahel region and by Chaka Zulu in southern Africa. The lack of seafaring nations in Africa explains why so many inhabitants of the islands located near the African coast came from other parts of the world. This is the case for the Réunion, the Seychelles, Mauritius, the Comoros, and especially Madagascar, which was colonized during the last 2 millennia by sailors coming from what is now called Indonesia. Inside the continent, there are other important geographical obstacles. To begin with, large rivers in Africa have always been barriers for people moving perpendicular to their banks. The humid equatorial forest and the Kalahari Desert are also formidable natural obstacles. And we didn't talk about the endemic and often deadly African diseases such as malaria, tuberculosis, yellow fever, AIDS, or Ebola. The rainy season is also a natural obstacle which transforms the continent roads into muddy rivers when vehicle breaks, which significantly increase the cost of transportation. Genetically speaking, African has the greatest diversity in the world, which is not a surprise since our species came from their continent. Nowadays, 3 different races share the African continent. First, there are, of course, the black Africans themselves. There are also the white Africans who came from Europe during the last centuries, for example the Boers, and the San peoples who still occupy a large part of southern Africa. Among the Sans, the Bushmen and the Hottentots still speak what is called click languages. They are called click languages because when a San speaks his mother tongue, the sound click, click, click can be heard. Since the Sans live in the Kalahari Desert, anthropologists believe that they are an ancient population that has been forced to retreat into an inhospitable environment by other more technically advanced African peoples. Culturally, the natural isolation of the continent is probably the reason why so many Africans keep believing in sorcery, witchcraft, and amulets. These beliefs play an important role in their daily lives. Historically, the invasion that had the most durable effects on the African cultures came from outside sub-Saharan Africa, notably those coming from the Maghreb, that long and narrow strip of densely populated territories located along the Mediterranean Sea. Traveling from north to south and perpendicular to the coast, the Maghrebi merchants followed the chain of oases scattered in the Sahara Desert to reach sub-Saharan Africa, where they bought goods in high demand around the Mediterranean Sea, such as gold, ivory, and slaves. To do that, the Maghrebis used the camels which had been introduced in North Africa by the Romans. It was the camels that enabled the conquest of the Sahara Desert by the Maghrebis and the Arabs. The commercial contacts between the two sides of the desert were so important that the Maghrebis eventually Islamized the natives of the Sahel region. Sometimes they even became the rulers of local kingdoms like the Kanem-Bornu, Songhai, and Ghana. In the case of Ghana, that domination was probably based on some technical or military superiority imported from the Mediterranean world, since we now know that 44 white princes reigned on a black Soninke majority during the 4th century. In Eastern Africa, external influences were even more significant and much older, as this side of Africa has always been in contact with the greatest ancient civilizations established along the Nile River and around the Red Sea. For instance, ancient Egypt was clearly the origin of the black civilization of Kush-Napata Meroe, which was located south of the Nile cataracts that separated ancient Egypt and Black Sudan. The relation between the two countries was so important that the pharaohs of the 25th Egyptian dynasty were Sudanese. Nowadays, there are still hundreds of very elegant pyramids in Sudan which were clearly produced by the Sudanese. Ethiopia was another African country which created a very complex society. That being said, it is clear that the civilization of Sudan and Ethiopia were protected by natural geographical obstacles. Sudan was protected by the cataracts of the Nile and by large deserts, while Christian Ethiopia was protected by difficult-to-cross mountains. Unfortunately, the East African coast was much easier to invade by the Arabs, the Persians, and the Indians, who, for many centuries, used the region as a source of slaves. The massacres and the destructions carried out in Eastern Africa by the slave traders, who were mostly black Africans, were responsible for the immense cultural setbacks accumulated by sub-Saharan Africa over the centuries. By systematically killing chiefs, sorcerers, warriors, babies, old people, and all those who couldn't be sold as slaves, the slave hunter drained the continent of its vital forces, preventing it from reaching its full potential. The East African slave trade was so destructive that for such a long time that it gave birth to the Swahili civilization, which incorporated many cultural elements coming from the different civilizations surrounding the Indian Ocean. Here also, the routes for exporting the slaves and the other African products ran perpendicular to the continent coasts. Since the demand for African slaves came from Asia, we can say that from an economic point of view, slave trading posts like Malindi and Zanzibar were more a part of the Western Indian Ocean than of East Africa. The third major cultural influence that broke Africa's natural isolation was, of course, European colonialism, which also came from the coast. It was by far the most important one, since it involved all the coast of Africa at the same time. Since the oceans are flat and cover 71% of the Earth's surface, Europeans were able during the last 5 centuries to reach all the coastal countries of Africa at a very low cost. Before the arrival of Europeans in the 15th century, Southern Africa, for example, remained completely isolated and had hardly ever received visitors. This is why, in the 21st century, we still find tribes in the Kalahari Desert that hunt game with bows and arrows. Since Africa, in the 15th century, was seen as an obstacle between Europe and Asia, the commercial relations between Europe and Africa were then confined to the coasts. The profits made by trading with Asia were so immense that very few European merchants showed interest for the goods produced in Africa. Anyway, the continent was immense and very little was known about its internal geography. On the coast, there were no road networks, no large cities, and very few rich and well-organized kingdoms like those found in Europe, Asia, and America. Furthermore, the African forests harbored deadly diseases, as we said earlier, as well as dangerous animals. Finally, it was a phenomenon affecting another continent that forced Europeans to change their mind about Africa. That phenomenon was the severe labor shortage that caused in the Americas by the collapse of the indigenous population who died en masse following the involuntary introduction by the Spanish conquistadores of dozens of deadly European diseases. As the European demand for the tropical products made in the Americas kept growing, some European merchants had the idea to replace the disappearing indigenous Americans by the African slaves that were sold by several coastal African kingdoms. Soon, the European slave traders discovered that they could increase their profits and reduce the time it took to cross the Atlantic Ocean by following the natural oceanic currents which flow in a clockwise direction between Europe, Africa, and the three Americas. That triangular trade route linked the markets of the three continents and nearly eliminated the cost of crossing the ocean with empty ships. Departing from Europe with holds filled with weapons, tools, and other manufactured goods, European merchants traded them for black slaves sold on the coast of Africa, slaves they traded in the Americas for the tropical products which were in high demand in Europe. The profits generated by that economic cycle were so important that the demand for African slaves exploded, which destabilized Black Africa for centuries. In fact, there were three different slave trades. The internal African trade, which likely dates back to prehistory, the Muslim slave trade across the Indian Ocean, which lasted for millennia, and the Atlantic slave trade by the Western world, which lasted more than 3 centuries, from the 16th century to the 19th century. Those three slave trades had extremely negative long-term cultural consequences. Since the blacks were the main victims of those slave trades, it created among them an inferiority complex that is still alive today. The fact that the slaves sold on the world markets were the product of the negative selection which killed the African elites, the slave trade also created a contempt for the black race which didn't disappear yet from the surface of the earth. Historically, it is the control of the oceans by the Western powers that gave them the control of the international trade. The profits produced by the trade with Asia, by the development of the three Americas, and by the slave trade were so immense that Westerners were able to finance several revolutions that would transform all the civilization of the world. First, the introduction all over the world of food crops developed by the indigenous people of the Americas caused a population explosion in Eurasia and especially in Europe. I'm talking about food crops like corn, potatoes, cassava, tomatoes, beans, etc. Second, the profits made by the control of the international trade financed the immigration of tens of millions of Europeans in the three Americas, in Oceania, in South Africa, and in Siberia. Third, those profits financed the formation of European empires. Fourth, they fueled a scientific and industrial revolution that spread like wildfire across all 5 continents between 1750 and the year 2000. If slavery was abolished in the Western world in the second half of the 19th century, it is still tolerated in the Muslim world. It was because the Industrial Revolution, with its very efficient machinery, made slavery obsolete. It is worth mentioning here that the abolition of slavery, at least on the Atlantic Ocean, was not the result of a slave revolt, but the result of a moral campaign orchestrated in the Western world by humanists who demanded its end. The American Civil War, which led to the abolition of slavery in the United States, caused the death of around 620,000 white men between 1861 and 1865. The involvement of black Africans in the slave trade has been so important that in the 21st century, African scholars are openly criticizing the African nations who openly traded slaves all over the continent. It's only when Europeans had conquered the rest of the world that they turned their attentions towards the interior of sub-Saharan Africa. In the 19th century, the rapid development of modern medicines played an important role in the colonization of the continent by reducing the mortality rate due to African diseases. Quinine, for example, which is used against malaria, was developed in 1820. The colonial carving up of black Africa that followed was done peacefully thanks to the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, where the rules for dividing it were established. Essentially, the European colonizers followed the path of least resistance to build their African empires. Starting from the trading posts they already had on the coasts, they used the rivers to penetrate the continent and stopped progressing as soon as they encountered the representatives of another European power. Most colonizing countries sought to establish a physical link between the colonies they already control on the different coasts of the continent. After the end of the First World War in 1918, Great Britain would be the winner of that race by taking the control of the German colony of Tanzania, which allowed it to regroup all the territories connecting South Africa to Egypt. Since those empire builders were newcomers on the continent, they created their colonies without taking into account the African realities and without consulting the Africans. As a result, their colonies were organized on a scale corresponding to the technological level reached by 19th century Europe. Since Europeans had little knowledge of the continent's geography, many artificial and perfectly linear borders appeared on the maps, and several African tribes found themselves divided between 2, 3, and sometimes 4 different countries. As for the future African metropolises, most were built on the coast by Europeans to facilitate the export of the continent's riches. This being done, the colonizers built a network of roads that all converge towards the coast. That created a communication system that was oriented towards the oceans on a continent where the natives always developed their societies inland, almost as if the oceans didn't exist. Because the colonial powers didn't really understand what they were doing, they unintentionally triggered many social, cultural, and especially demographic revolutions all over the continent. By abolishing slavery and its massacres, and by forbidding tribal wars, they eliminated two of the most effective traditional systems which historically had controlled the demographics of Africa. If the colonization of Africa lasted less than a century, it was essentially because it was never profitable. Colonial powers could spend fortunes to equip the continent. They were never able to meet the demands of an ever-growing population. If the partition of Africa was done without creating any major war, the same can be said about its decolonization, with the notable exception of Southern Africa, a region where a significant population of European descent had settled. In a way, the decolonization of Africa was the result of a general flight of the colonizers who couldn't cope with the ever-growing African population. In the 1960s, the most educated Africans became the leaders of countries which had been organized to serve the needs of the colonizers. Realizing that any attempt to reorganize the continent to respect the African values and needs would provoke endless wars, the first African heads of states decided from the outset to maintain the organization left behind by the colonial powers. They kept the borders designed by Europeans, as well as the European languages, in order to be able to communicate easily within the newly independent countries, as well as on the international scene. That decision was wise, since, despite the tribal wars which weakened many countries, Africa did not experience any large-scale international wars since decolonization. Southern Africa was again an exception to the rule. In 2025, continental Africa counts 54 independent countries, 16 of which are landlocked, which means that they don't have any direct access to the oceans. In addition to those 54 independent states, there are 10 non-sovereign territories which are almost all located in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. From a geopolitical standpoint, Black Africa is currently transitioning from the tribal stage to the national stage imposed by the Europeans. Nowadays, the massive and extremely rapid urbanization of the continent, along with the increasing number of intertribal marriage, is creating in each country a cultural melting pot where the neutral language of communication is the one left behind by the colonizers. That process, which is far from finished, is delayed and even hindered by some purely African phenomena. For example, some African tribes are already so large that they have already reached the national stage. I'm thinking about nations such as the Hausas, the Yorubas, or the Igbos of West Africa, which all have tens of millions of members as well as a rich cultural and historical heritage. That seems to indicate that some very populous African states, such as Nigeria and Congo, could someday disintegrate to form viable nation-states that would use African local languages as their official languages. Africa has thousands of local languages. The Bantu group alone regroup at least 350 languages. This being said, the most worrying African problems is probably the lack of nationalism. Since the defeat of the Nazis, it has been fashionable, at least in the Western world, to denigrate nationalism without taking into account its positive aspects. For instance, nationalism often leads citizens to sacrifice their own personal interest and even their lives for the well-being of their homeland. When patriotism is absent in a country, its citizens tend to defend their tribe interests rather than the country they belong to. This is the case almost everywhere in Africa. In Africa, corruption and frauds have been major problems since decolonization. Almost everywhere, the heads of states use their armies not to defend the country and its borders, but to keep the entire population under the control of their own ethnic group. Those leaders also tend to justify their policies by publishing false statistics. As a result, Africa is a continent where almost everybody dreams of getting rich, not by working hard like in Japan or China, but by selling oil, gas, and raw materials on the international market. If Africans have very serious problems, it remains that their continent is the youngest on the planet and the one where everything changes very fast due to the present invasion of modern communication system. The coastal infrastructure left behind by Europeans, the paved road that crosses the Sahara Desert, and the African international airports play a significant role in the cultural revolution Africa is undergoing in the 21st century. Second, the internet and the present mobile phone invasion are transforming the African cultures, especially in the intellectual domain. Nowadays, all Africans, including those with very little education, have access to the same information available to the Westerners, the Indians, and the Latin Americans. That information is currently pouring down from the sky thanks to the dense network of satellites set up by private companies. Unfortunately, the main flaw of the internet is that it provides information that have not been filtered. As a result, extremist ideologies, wokeism, and pornography are disrupting a continent that is totally unprepared to receive them. In Africa, the acceleration of history guarantees that changes that took 100 years to occur in industrial Europe and 50 years in East Asia could take place in Africa in just 20 or 30 years. The rapid updating of the African mentalities will be greatly accelerated by the immense economic depression that has already begun in many countries, especially if we take into account the brutal interruption of the foreign aid coming from the Western world. Unable to fund the research to combat African epidemics, the other continents will soon become so poor that they will be unable to subsidize the international migrations coming from Africa. Nowadays, most non-Africans think that Africa will always remain a dependent continent. Most fear the disruptions coming from it, and very few realize the enormous catch-up that is currently happening on the continent. Most mass media don't cover the internal wars of Africa, which affects millions of people in the Sahel region, in Congo, or elsewhere on the continent. They prefer to focus on the problems of Eurasia. Almost no one outside of Africa is talking about the conflicts that could someday occur along the Nile River, where giant dams are being built by Sudan and Ethiopia without taking into account the Egyptian concerns about the Nile water levels. Recently, new countries like South Sudan and Somaliland have even been created without provoking strong reactions in the international community. There is even a tiny little African country, Djibouti, located at the end of the Red Sea, where many superpowers have built military bases. Nobody talks about it. That indifference is astonishing, since sub-Saharan Africa is presently the region of the world with the fastest growing economy. The Chinese, who seem to be aware of it, have invested massively on the continent. Nowadays, 1 million Chinese workers are building modern infrastructure all over the continent, such as the modern city of Quilamba in Angola, which will soon host 200,000 inhabitants. If the catch-up of sub-Saharan Africa relative to the rest of the world will occur in the coming decades, the natural isolation of the continent will, however, continue to reduce its international influence. As we showed in the third video of this series, when we discussed the natural weaknesses of a continental superpower like the defunct USSR, a continent without an easy access to the oceans cannot expect to ever become a dominant superpower. Even if the largest nations of Africa were to reach a population of 1 billion people, it's extremely unlikely that they will be able to intervene massively on the other 4 continents. This being said, Africa is changing fast, and the rest of the world would be well advised to take it into account. The next video of this series will be about the geopolitics of Latin America. Thank you in advance for liking this video, for recommending it to your friends, and for subscribing to my channel. If you do speak French, and if you want to learn more about the laws of geopolitics, you should also read my book on geopolitics. See you next time.